I'm Addison Abernathy, and I serve as a regular pioneer and an elder in the Pekin, Illinois congregation. I was baptized in 1947.
I'm June Anderson, and I was born in Greenbush, Illinois, and I'm a member of the Galesburg, Illinois congregation. I was baptized on June 17th, 1941, and it was in a farmer's little pond out in the country, north of Knoxville, Illinois.
Yeah, my name is Robert Rodine, and I was baptized in 1939. I was born February 13th, 1928.
My name is Bernard Williamson. Everybody calls me Bernie. I was born in Canton, Illinois, July 6, 1922. That's 96 years ago. I was baptized on August 29th, 1954, in a horse trough in Jacksonville at an assembly.
I'm Lorraine Thomas, but somewhere along the line they named me Sally, so everybody knows me now as Sally Thomas. I was born in Beardstown, Illinois. They didn't even have a hospital then, so it was a home delivery. I was baptized in 1942 and in a farmer's pond, and they told us to go home and take a shower because the cattle were in there.
My mother and I both were baptized at the same time at Hollywood, California. And the reason was because we attended the national convention, which was at Los Angeles. And they rented a pool in Hollywood, so we had to go by bus to Hollywood to be baptized. Relatives came through from California, and we were going to camp in the trailer or tent city that was provided. And so that was in 1946. I was just out of the military that year, in the first part of the year. And so now I believe the convention in 1946 was in August. And so it was an 8-day convention, international that is, and in 1946 at Cleveland, Ohio. We were very church-going people, my mother and I, my family in fact, and so therefore it was quite a shock as to what we heard and learned, but it thoroughly convinced us that this was the truth and we wanted it.
I was baptized in a lake. It was called Lake Keoma. It was a little state park in Iowa. My family learned the truth through special pioneers coming around to the door-to-door, and they grabbed a hold of the truth right away. I met my wife. We had to move to Peoria because my dad was transferred on the railroad. His job ended up being in Peoria. My wife's name was Phyllis. And Phyllis and her dad, her father, Phil Steinmetz, was a company servant at the time.
Back in those days, when the zone servant, as they were called in those days, came through, they would have a talk, and anyone in the congregation that wanted to get baptized, and they'd have a talk, and you'd go get baptized in whatever facilities they arranged for. And at that time, when I was baptized, there were 6 of us that was baptized at that time. I was 8.5 years old when I was baptized. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, there was a family that came and studied with my folks. And then, and from, I guess from there on, then we just was always Jehovah's Witnesses.
I learned the truth through my wife. She saved my life, actually, because I was getting involved with my work effort at Caterpillar. I had a visit, or I didn't have a visit, it was my wife's visit of two pioneer sisters who came to our home and witnessed to Betty. And when I found out about it, I didn't like it at all, because I'd been raised in the Christian church, and I thought that was the way to go because my father was a minister in the Christian church. One of the pioneers' brother, whose name was Norman Hess, said, "I'm going to be leaving to go to Hawaii, but I'm going to give a public talk at the Kingdom Hall Sunday. And it's on marriage and the family." Betty said, "Oh, I'd like to hear that. I want to go. Bernie can stay home and look after the boys." I said, "No, I'm not going to stay home and look after the boys. I'm going to go with you." I started going with her that very night, and we've been going now for so many years.
Well, back in those days, it was, you could date anyone. So I was dating Paul, and I told him and I'd like to learn what kind of religion he had, because they had been to the assembly in St. Louis before. So then he said, "Well, let's go talk to my dad." And from then on, it was go. Well, I think it was because I sat beside my father-in-law at that time, and I asked him, I said, "Is there really a Jehovah?" I didn't know that. I didn't know Jehovah had a name. Well, it didn't take me very long to realize after I talked to my husband and my father-in-law, and they sat down and they showed me the Bible, and actually, I mean, I knew nothing about Adam and Eve. I just thought it was a story. So then they started studying with me.
We had never been to any meetings. We don't remember of any Jehovah's Witnesses calling by. And so going to this 8-day convention was our first. We came home from the convention. My relatives wrote the branch, and then this brought John and Mary Taylor to our home to let us know that we were to go to Lewiston to the congregation. However, they had not even been to the convention. He was a farmer and new in the truth. And so they accepted us as Jehovah's Witnesses when we attended the meetings because we'd been to the convention. So after a few weeks of attending twice a week at the meetings, driving 50 miles to get there, that is 25 each way, one of the witnesses in the Lewiston congregation said, "Well, you folks need to study. You haven't even studied yet." So we said, "Well, sure, we'd welcome that." So then an elderly couple from Bryant, Illinois, drove a 50-mile trip to study with us. And my mother and I said, "Well, they can't come all that distance just to study with us. We've got to go out and get people in here, into our home." So we did, and we got the minister down, because people still accepted us as part of the community and part of the church. So the minister readily came, and we had about 23 people there for our first study. And the second time he came, we kind of challenged him about Christmas, and he says, "Oh, I know Jesus wasn't born December 25th." And then we challenged him about hell, and this shocked us. He says, "Now, you're not going to get that out of the churches." Well, we weren't trying to get it out of the churches. And so he says, "But I know hell is the grave." That's what shocked us. And so my mother says, "You know that hell is the grave? Well, why don't you teach it?" And he says, as he pushed back his chair, "Well, after all, I have to make a living." So he never came again. I guess we put him to the test.
I was 13 years old, and there was a convention in St. Louis, and Judge Rutherford was the speaker. And that was the year the children's book was distributed. So my wife was there, although I didn't know her. But all of us young people were there. My mother borrowed a car, and you'll see a model of it. It's an exact replica of the car that we borrowed to go to St. Louis in. And it was borrowed from a family that was in the truth. They were farmers, and that was kind of their little fun car. And so she drove it to St. Louis with me. On the way home, my mother couldn't drive any longer. We didn't have money for motels or anything else, just enough money for gasoline. So I had to drive halfway home. We got to the border of the Iowa border. We had 200 more miles to go. So I drove the car the other 200 miles.
In 1958, at Polo Grounds and the Yankee Stadium, Brother Nathan Noor was there, and Fred Franz. And I remember Fred Franz standing or giving a talk against the United Nations, and there we were standing or sitting right in the balcony of the United Nations, and he gave a blue string talk about the United Nations and its eventually demise, that it would come to naught. That was quite an experience. I hadn't really planned to go, but one of my friends, one of the associates and brothers, got a car. He said he'd take me and another brother in his car for the last 3 days of the assembly. So we drove nonstop out to New York. Distributor cap broke. I had to go up and down the streets of Harlem trying to find repairs for the car. Didn't have a place to stay, but ended up sleeping on the floor in my wife's hotel room. We had the meals cooked there on the assembly grounds. There were 8-day assembly. We were all young then in those days.
The first one I went to was in Buffalo, New York. And I don't remember too much about it, but I know we were assigned to stay in a room outside of Buffalo. And to get there, you had to go on a bus. And one time the driver said, keep all your literature out of sight. So we did. So the next time he said, now I'm going to drive right on by your normal stop because there's a gang waiting for you. So he drove on he took us all the way down, And that was the end of his route, so he was headed back to wherever he was going, and he let us off right at our street. Well, that was a bit of a chore. You get those 8-day conventions, and I remember one time we were in New York. We had all 3 kids, and a sister up about 40 miles north of New York. She had an empty house, but it was furnished, and so it was so long getting out of the traffic that I took 2 thermos jugs, one hot and one cold, so I could able to wash the kids up and get them in their pajamas. We finally got there. Of course, they were sound asleep, so we carried them in. Did the same thing the next day.
And then in 1954, my wife, which I had picked up along the way, and I were appointed to Special Pioneers, and we were sent to Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania. In 1959, I was appointed to serve as a circuit servant. That's what is called a circuit overseer today. So what it was you were assigned a circuit overseer, and the first 2 weeks you spent with another circuit overseer. And the first week you received training from him as he was serving a congregation. Then the second week, with the circuit overseer that you were being trained, then he let you do as much as you were able to do with that 1 week being with him. And then the third week, that was it. You started your first congregation.
When I was at a young age, the time was when they had mob violence, was always anticipated that. And we had little towns that we called hot spots that we knew that they always had different groups that would form. And so when I was probably about 10 years old, I remember going to some of these towns, and we'd have what they had designated drivers, and they would get the car group, and they'd know ahead of time where we were going to work in these little towns. And we would go, and they'd let us out, and then the car drivers would go and just drive around town. If they saw some people forming downtown that looked like maybe it was a mob forming, they'd come and pick us all up, and we'd leave town. We'd have the town worked and be gone before the mob could get formed. So there were several times like that. And we never thought about not going. We just knew we were to preach and we was to go in the service, and that's what we did. And we never had the fear of what might happen. We just knew Jehovah would be with us. Well, an experience that I could think of that really was, you might say, a test of faith was when our daughter was born. The blood transfusion issue came up. And back in those days, when she was born, I'm giving her age now, was in 53. And you just knew you was going to have a baby, and you went in and you didn't think anything about preparing a doctor ahead of time like we do today about the blood issue and that. And because of complications, I lost quite a bit of blood. My blood count got down to 4, and he said that he wanted to give me a transfusion. And I told him no, that because of religious reasons, I wouldn't accept a blood transfusion. I called my husband on the phone and told him what the doctor had said. So he and my father went over and talked to the doctor after work, and he said, well, I would never go against anybody's religion. If they don't want blood transfusion, he said, even though I might not agree, I would never violate anyone's decision on that. And so that was kind of a test, being a first-time mother and going through that. But you could feel Jehovah's strength and his behind backing you when you stood up firm for what you believed and what you knew was right.
My wife was just a young girl, and her 2 brothers, and they were in the service right outside Chillicothe, Illinois. They tried to overturn the car. There was a mob formed, and there was a Catholic priest that was leading them, shouting them on, trying to encourage them. And so they were trying to turn the car over. They had taken the hood off the car and taken the spark plugs out of it so he couldn't drive away. I think my wife was like 11 or 12 years old. And my father-in-law decided, they almost got the car rolled over, and he was afraid that it would catch fire if they succeeded in getting it rolled over. So they got out of the car, and they started then, of course, beating on the witnesses. But they had a 2x4. They was hitting my father-in-law with a 2x4, and he was on the ground, and my wife kept trying to stop them, and they would just pick her up and throw her out of the way, and she would go right back, and they'd pick her up and throw her out of the way again. And the only thing that stopped them, and I always figured that Jehovah's hand is in that matter, it was a doctor and a nurse seeing what was going on. So they stopped the car, and that doctor shamed them about, they were beating on him after he was unconscious. So his nose was partially torn away from his face. He had teeth gone, and he was pretty battered around the face and the head. And so the nurse ripped her slip. She pulled her slip off and ripped it off and tore it into bandages. And she bandaged my father-in-law up so that they could get him to the doctor, you know. And all night long, the mobsters drove back and forth in front of their house in the Heights. They followed them, and they honked and raised all sorts of problems. And they tried to call the police. The police wouldn't stop them. The police wouldn't have anything to do with it. So that went on all night long, in addition to the beating that he had taken and the trauma that the family had to go through.
I'd graduated from the University of Illinois and went to work at Caterpillar. My boss found out that I was a witness and becoming interested in the Jehovah's Witnesses. That ended my advancement that way. I never got to the higher echelons. I'm glad that I didn't, because when I decided I wanted to be a witness, that was really a salvation for me.
My dad jumped up and he said, "You get out of the house. I don't have any Jehovah's Witnesses in my house." So I did. Well, we lived about 5 miles from a brother that my parents knew him. I don't think they knew he was one of Jehovah's Witnesses at that time, but I wasn't allowed to take a thing out of the house. So I walked to there, and then they took me into Paul's dad. And so it was a struggle. Shortly after I was married with Paul, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. And I had to go to court with him, and heard them actually say, "You want to change your mind?" He said, "I'll never change my mind." So boom, we got 3 years. He told me, I never will forget when they took him, and they they let me, the officers that were taking us said they were going down there anyway, so I could ride with them. And the last thing that, when my husband handed me his billfold, He said, there's enough money for you to get in there to go stay with my relatives. At that time, the only women they were hiring was women whose husband were in the military. So the minute I would apply for a job, they'd say, where's your husband? And I would tell them, and I never got the job. So finally I used a little common sense, I guess, and I said, they asked me where my husband was, and I said, well, he's with the United States government in Ashland, Kentucky. That got the job. They thought he was doing something good.
If I could give one piece of advice, it would be to read your Bible often.
Do not put one foot into the world.
Stay close to Jehovah.
The joy of Jehovah is your stronghold.
Always stay close to Jehovah's organization. Always be obedient to those taking the lead.
I've read the entire Bible many times in the many years that I've been associated, and the New World Translation is so superior.
Don't test out the world, because the world is it's a disaster. The friends that you think are friends are not your friends. And, you find that out the hard way. You put trust in people. As you drift away from the truth, you'll start trusting people. And that's a terrible mistake.
Because you know that they're the ones that have been appointed to help us. And as long as we listen to them and follow their advice, that's going to help to be a protection to us. Because we know Jehovah is the one that's directing it through his son Jesus. And so if we always stay close to the brothers, stay close to the congregation, then that's going to be a safeguard for us.
Try to arrange to pioneer. Of course, we have auxiliary pioneering. So start out with that and just stick with it if you can.
I think that my favorite scripture is Psalms 55:22, where it talks about that Jehovah will never let the righteous one fall. And that's something I've always kept in mind, that as long as we're doing what he wants us to, he's going to be behind us, and that we don't have to worry about what's going on around us, that he'll see to it that we're taken care of.
I shared this scripture with our circuit overseer now, and he says that's one of his favorites. It's from 19th Psalm, verse 14. It says, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasurable to you, O Jehovah, my rock and my redeemer.
I think what impressed me was Matthew 24:14. Today I was thinking about love and thinking, Jehovah always wanted us to express love.
It's remembering what he has done for me. Everything that I feel, even though I was failing him, I feel like everything that happened in my life was to my benefit. I mean, it benefited me, and I never had control over it. I feel like I didn't have control over it, but he still was helping me, even when I didn't deserve help. And I often thought, even if Jehovah didn't accept me, I was going to be on his side. regardless.